Hey everyone, I'm Ryan, and Alec and I will be going over nutrition versus exercise intervention as a means for fat loss. So, beginning before even going into the different kinds of interventions, it's important to know what fat is and the differences between fat loss and fat burning because those two concepts are often quite interchangeable, even though they mean two slightly different things. So, fat loss is directly correlated with the weight loss that's coming strictly from fat, while fat burning is the fat cell simply releasing glycerol into the bloodstream as free fatty acids, and they are transported through the blood to the tissues where the energy is needed. And by burning the stored fats within the fat cell, you're breaking down and mobilizing the fat cell, increasing your metabolic rate, and inhibiting the enlargement of the fat cells. So, fat is essentially adipose tissue. It's a loose connective tissue that's full of adipocytes. It's essentially responsible for storing fats in the form of triglycerides. And it's found essentially all over the body. It's subcutaneous, so under the skin, packed around organs, visceral, also found between muscles and within bone marrow, and essentially found all over the body. So moving on to fat metabolism, fat is stored as triglycerides with hormone-sensitive lipase (HSL) being the primary enzyme that releases the stored fats, with insulin acting as a major inhibitor towards the action of HSL because, of course, insulin promotes glucose transport into the fat cell, causing storage into the cell, making insulin not really ideal because when insulin is not available, storage is blocked to the fat cell, and that's what we want for fat metabolism. Because when fat metabolism occurs, there is a combination of an absence of insulin, the presence of HSL, and then a trigger needs to happen for fat metabolism to occur. And that trigger can be in the form of adrenaline, growth hormone, and of course, the most important one being exercise. And once that happens, triglycerides and fatty acids will be converted in the liver to ketones for energy. And as you're training, as you're working out, blood flow will increase to the active muscles, and you'll have more free fatty acids being delivered to the muscles that do, in fact, need them. So, free fatty acids get inside the mitochondria by lipolysis, and this is where free fatty acids go to be burned essentially. When the free fatty acids are released from the fat cell itself shrinks, and that is what causes people to have that sort of lean body mass sort of physical appearance. Because when the body loses fat, the fat cell itself is literally shrinking. Not the fat cell itself isn't being burned; it's shrinking because the fat within the cell is being removed and mobilized. And now, so moving on to the waist hip ratio, there are basically two forms: the pear-shaped body being the gynoid, that's mainly contributing towards women, and versus the android apple-shaped body that's found mostly among men. So, an individual with a gynoid body, they sort of tend to store fat in the hip and thighs, while an android body will tend to store fat in the trunk and abdominal regions. So, and the basic recommendation for this is that men have a waist to hip ratio of less than one being optimal, while women having a ratio of zero point 0.9 or less. And basically, the take home message from this, the main point is that body weight and fat distribution throughout the body is multifactorial. So that each individual or like each individual client that you have will gain and lose body weight from various different body areas. So when thinking of a training regimen or specific activities to do, it really has to be specific towards that person. So moving on to physical activity with fat metabolism in mind, what fat is and how fat is distributed throughout the body. We really want to approach physical activity from a holistic perspective of like not simply just cardio, which is the popular belief of what should be done for fat loss, but rather a combination of resistance training and also cardio. because resistance training is found to increase high density lipoproteins cholesterol, HDL, the good cholesterol, and it also decreases triglycerides and cholesterol within the chylomicrons that acts as a critical transporter for dietary triglycerides. So you really have to involve the entire body through high intensity intervals because the higher heart rate you burn, the more calories. And basically, the goal through this is sort of how we discussed about the general adaptation syndrome of like how you have the alarm phase and supercompensation and then rest. The sort of same aspect can be applied is that the main goal we want to do is sort of elevate the resting metabolic rate because what you burn in 24 hours can essentially be seen as more sustainable than exercising away the calorie surplus that you have for a training session. So you really want to elevate your RMR, work out, and then the next few training sessions, elevate your RMR again, work out, and then just keep going up as you elevate your RMR. So let's say at the beginning of training in 1 month, your RMR, let's say 2,000 calories. So what you burn just by laying down. And then at the end of all the training sessions of adaptation, let's say your RMR is now 2,300 calories. So now in a 24-hour period, you're burning 300 more calories than you were previously. And it's just more, it's not short term, it is a more over time, you will see a gradual loss of fat, but it is much more sustainable and worth it than rather than just like one short term workout. So essentially combining resistance training and cardio at a high intensity through high volume is the optimal way to go. And we want to go at a high intensity because we could sort of use the EPOC to our advantage. Because by beginning a workout at an oxygen deficit, and as you get further along in your training session, the oxygen consumption being increased and not meeting the demands of your workout. So once you operate at the oxygen deficit and then get towards like the top of the graph, like we've seen before, this is where you'll start to breathe heavy, and then you'll go through the workout with high intensity activities that cause sort of the graph to spike. And then below that portion of the graph is the calories being burned. And then as you're doing the high intensity activities, this will cause a greater decline in the EPOC, causing you to burn an excessive amount of calories post workout. And now Alec will be discussing the nutrition recommendations.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk about, with nutrition, some of the largest contributors to fat gain and fat loss. So we have saturated fat with its high caloric content and also other high caloric foods where the caloric excess is stored as body fat. So that would be a contributor. And then with added sugars, these are empty calories that can cause overeating. With sodium, this can also increase hunger and cause overeating. So these are things to avoid if you're trying to lose fat. And then things that directly affect fat loss would be protein, fiber, monounsaturated fats, and carbohydrates. These all contribute to feeling full longer and therefore decreasing the risk of overeating. And then there's calcium, which can increase thermogenesis in the body, which boosts our metabolism for fat loss. And with vitamin D, this can minimize the formation of new fat cells. And I'm going to talk about a few specific diets, the first being the ketogenic diet, where we have increased calories coming from fats and less of them coming from carbs. This is to get fat loss from ketosis, where we have limited carb stores in the body, which causes us to start burning fat for energy. With this, it can be a bit risky in a couple ways. First being risking micronutrient deficiency from not getting the same amount of carbs like we normally would. It can also risk kidney damage from having less potassium from fruits, vegetables, and so forth. And then also this high fat can mean we could be getting high amounts of low density lipoprotein cholesterol, which can increase heart disease risk. This is said to be good for endurance athletes, but not so much high intensity athletes like sprinters. This is because, for example, one study found it causes us to go into quicker acidosis by lowering our body pH, which is a contributor to fatigue and anaerobic exercise like sprinting. Next, I'm going to talk about the paleo diet that's inspired by food from the Paleolithic era, like fruits, vegetables, meats, fish, no processed foods or dairy and those kind of things. With this diet, you're having a high protein intake and low intake of added sugar, which these can both help with losing fat. And it also does risk taking in too much saturated fat. So we definitely want to be mindful that we're getting unsaturated fat, also not too much saturated fat, because like I said before, saturated fat in excess can cause fat gain. For athletes, it overall does have a high intake of micronutrients that allows for us to train with possibly higher stress loads. So that's a potential benefit. And there will be some adjustments we'll want to make before, during, and after workouts to make sure we're meeting our dietary needs. So, for example, 2 hours before, we should be having high glycemic index foods with low fiber. And then during, sports drinks or gels are always good to get carbohydrates we need. And afterwards, a recovery drink with carbohydrates is a good way to go. A benefit to this diet is the low carb intake can train our body to use fat stores for energy, which is overall more efficient. So to talk about which is better between diet or physical activity, the easiest way is diet, because cutting calories is usually easier than burning them. Like swapping out a snack item for a healthier one could burn the same or cut the same amount of calories that we'd burn doing a 30 to 40-minute exercise, which most people would find swapping the food item to be easier. For keeping a healthy lifestyle, though, we'll want to focus on both, because exercise promotes longevity, decreases cardiovascular risk, increased bone health in those type of ways. And it does preserve lean muscle mass, which is something athletes should be mindful of. And then also it helps us to burn more calories than what we could just do by cutting things from our diet. So what we're trying to do by looking at both diet and physical activity is to combine them to create calorie deficit, which is where we're expending more calories than consuming them for fat loss. So by increasing physical activity, that increases our calorie expenditure, and then dieting monitors the calorie consumption. Lastly, I'm going to talk about how to balance the two of them. So there was a study that found a diet-only approach to losing body fat was just as effective as focusing on both diet and physical activity in the short term. However, in the long term, focusing on both was more effective. And then looking at only physical activity was less effective, both short term and long term. So this could be with the increased effectiveness of the combined approach in the long run, because dieting can lower metabolism, making us more likely to gain fat. So by exercising, we can help to keep off these unwanted pounds. What we want to be doing is targeting both diet and physical activity, therefore, so that we can be getting optimal health and also getting the long-lasting results that we want. So thank you for listening to our presentation, and here's our references.